Hi guys, and welcome to this week's tutorial. In this video I'll be showing you how I go about completing this pet portrait of a black and tan Jack Russell, whilst I also provide some tips and advice on how to paint or draw black fur. I start out this piece by transferring an outline over onto my paper, and then I begin to refine the sketch using Prismacolor Col-erase pencils. I sketch in these erasable coloured pencils because I find it helpful to break up the sketch by using a small selection of different colours. As well as drawing in the key features and fur pattern, I'll also map in some areas of highlight and shadow too. Contrast is key when drawing black fur, so by indicating contrasts early on in the sketching phase, I'll hopefully be more conscious of them later on during the rendering process. Once I'm happy with my outline, I'll start my foundational coloured pencil layers. I'm using a variety of coloured pencils for this piece, so I'll leave a list of all the materials I use and mention in the description box down below. So working on the ear and the left side of the dog's face, I start off by blocking in the lightest and darkest areas, and I map in the lightest areas using a pale blue, and I'll use a dark indigo blue for the shadows. I'll go into more detail about which colours I use later on, but my primary objective for the first layer is to get a rough idea of the underlying form by planning in my values. I'll adjust my colour and really push my contrasts further along in the process, but for now I don't want to make my shadows too dark, as I want to have room to build up the colour, texture and depth through the layering. As for the lighter areas, I know that I can get away with making them a touch darker than they will end up being to allow the highlights to stand out against them. And that brings me on to talk about the materials that I'm using and some suggestions and recommendations to make the process easier and more efficient. The surface that I'm working on is Clairefontaine Pastelmat, which I've already made an in-depth video about, so I'll leave a link to that down below in the description box and in the cards in the top right. Pastelmat is a very forgiving paper. It accepts many layers and the abrasive surface readily pulls pigment from the pencils. This means I can easily add extra layers to rework something entirely, or work lighter pencils over darker areas and still get them to stand out. This is ideal when drawing in pale details against a dark background, such as when I add fur texture by using individual strokes of a lighter colour. Because of this, I don't have to worry too much about going too dark, and I don't have to avoid colouring over areas that will stay pale, as I can just add these back in later on. On the other hand, if I was working on watercolour paper or drawing paper, which doesn't have the abrasive quality that Pastelmat has, I'd need to be much more careful and considerate with my layers. On this paper, I would work strategically from light to dark, and work around the areas that I want to keep light. So if you're not working on Pastelmat or any other type of abrasive surface, such as sanded paper, you could try using a texture fixative or workable fixative to help isolate your layers and regain some tooth. Another option is to use the brush and pencil touch-up texture, which is essentially a texture fixative that you can paint on instead of spray, and I use this later on in the process of this dog. Using a fixative in this way would mean that when drawing in highlights, your pale colours wouldn't mix into the darker layers underneath, so still remain bright and crisp. To help minimise smudging, I'm working from my non-dominant side towards my dominant side, so in my case, because I'm right-handed, I'm working generally left to right, and I also try to work from the top of the page towards the bottom. This is another special consideration I make when drawing black fur or any dark colour on a light coloured background. Smudges in this case would be quite difficult to erase, so I want to limit the time I have my hand resting on an area that already has pencil applied to it. Another method is to use glassine paper between your hand and your work, and this works really well, but I use it to a minimum whilst recording, as I don't want to obscure the artwork for the camera. Glassine is essentially a non-stick paper that's designed to protect artwork, and you can buy it in rolls or loose sheets, but conveniently pads of Pastelmat come interleaved with this paper, as do the wire-bound pads of Canson Mi-Teintes. And I'm sure that there are other brands of paper that also come interleaved with glassine too, but these are the two that I know of. So moving on from materials and taking a closer look at my method and what I suggest to keep in mind when rendering black fur. First up, I think it's important to not be put off by black fur, and the same applies to white fur. There's something about these two extremes that many people find intimidating. But in reality, the approach used to render black or white fur is more or less the same as drawing any other fur colour. It might help to think of black fur as just dark coloured fur instead, and by extension white fur as light coloured fur, as ultimately the coat colour isn't really just black or white, or even just shades of grey, but a great multitude of different colours and tones. So like I briefly mentioned earlier, I block in my initial layers by giving an indication of the highlights and shadows with a pale blue and a dark blue. I'm using blue here because this dog's fur is smooth and glossy, and the photo I took of him was whilst he was sitting outside on an overcast day. Daytime lighting tends to be quite cool, and since his fur is going to reflect the sky and lighting, there'll be a strong influence of those cool colours in his fur. If, however, the photo was taken around sunrise or sunset, I would be looking out for and replicating warm undertones in his fur with deep cool shadows instead, and if the day was cloudless with a bright blue sky, the blue undertones may be even more obvious. The blues I'm using though aren't bright and highly saturated, but instead quite muted. So for instance, some go-tos would be sky blue and light ultramarine for Polychromos, and Solway blue in the Derwent drawing for highlights. And for the shadows, I'd consider using Derwent drawing ink blue, Derwent Artist's Midnight from the Black and White 6 set, as well as deep indigo from the Polychromos. Any colour names I mention of course are just to give an idea about what sort of colours I might use amongst many others, and there's no hard and fast rules about which colours you can use and in what quantity. The colour of the subject matter can appear very different depending on lighting, but black fur has a lot of variation in it too. Some fur appears much warmer and browner than others, especially when it catches the light. So make sure to closely observe your own reference photo and adjust your colour choices accordingly. The undertones and reflected light in black fur is also going to be heavily dependent on the dog's environment, so for instance, if the dog is sitting on grass on a bright day, there may also be some subtle green tones mixed in there. Fur quality is also something to consider. Duller, less glossy fur will reflect less light, so the blue from the sky or the green from the grass is going to be even more subtle, if perceptible at all. But of course, I'm not using just blues to realistically render this dog. If I see that the blues are getting too saturated or obviously blue on my paper, I'll lightly layer over them with some brown to help warm things up and neutralise them a touch. I'll mainly use warm and dark browns for this, so for example walnut brown and burnt umber from the Polychromos. And similarly, if an area becomes too warm with browns, I'll glaze in some blues. I'll also use dark browns elsewhere in the fur as an undertone. For example, I noticed that the fur between his eyes, on the top of his muzzle, and on the ear on the right had lots of warmer and more of a brown coloration. And a handy tip to help see these more subtle colours is to increase the saturation of your photo in a simple photo editor. On top of these colours, I also use a wide assortment of grey colours. Polychromos has a wonderful selection of warm and cool greys, and I also used the Caran, Pablos and Luminance, which have some interesting neutral colours too. To create lively looking black fur, even if it's not glossy, make sure to include a variety of different neutrals and not just black and white and the shades of flat grey in between. If you're unsure what specific colours to use, I suggest creating a colour breakdown of the image you're using, and I do this digitally by opening my reference in a simple photo editor like Microsoft Paint, and then I use the eyedropper tool to select areas of colour that I'm finding difficult to read. I then draw this colour at the edge of my digital canvas, and seeing the colour out of context makes it easier to analyse and compare to the swatch charts I've made of the pencils that I own. If you'd like to see a step-by-step guide for this, I'll leave a link in the description box down below to a blog post that I made showing what I do, as well as a bunch of other handy tips to help break down a reference photo. If you have a physical copy of your reference image, you can instead try judging colour by making a viewfinder with a very small opening to lay on top of the area of the image you want to analyse. The next thing to consider is your contrast and values. These are fundamental in describing the anatomy of the animal, but also the difference between your highlights and shadows will also help to describe the fur colour. For example, you may realise that black fur is actually a lot paler than you first expected, especially if a lot of the fur is in highlight because it's glossy and brightly lit. To avoid the dog looking like it has grey fur, the areas cast in shadow must be in strong contrast to the highlights. In this instance, it may be helpful to play around with your reference image in a simple photo editor and adjust the contrast slider to see what sort of impact this has on the animal's appearance. I find it useful to make and refer to an image where I've boosted the contrast so it's a little stronger than I want to aim for, as I find that it's quite natural to play it safe with the contrast when I'm rendering, so my result will always be less dramatic than the reference I used anyway. Creating a black and white version of your reference may also be useful for checking your values, especially if you compare it to a black and white photo of your work in progress. Moving on to my next tip, a reference photo of an animal with black fur may have areas that are very underexposed, so there may be areas on the image that seem to be pure, flat black. Whilst I don't recommend choosing to work from a reference where there's a lot of underexposure, some underexposure can be expected and can be worked around. In order to be able to interpret form and detail in these underexposed areas, I'll play around with brightness and exposure settings in a simple photo editor to create a bonus reference that I'm able to pick out the detail and form from. I will still build up the shadow and contrast so that it's similarly dark to the original reference photo, but having a grasp of the underlying form will result in a more thoughtful and convincing representation, and any subtle detail that does show through will help to break up the darkness. And that brings me on to the last topic, building up the fur texture and applying the fur detail. Value is always more important when rendering animal anatomy, but fur texture can help to reinforce the underlying form. Here it's crucial to closely observe your reference and pay attention to the directional angle and length of the fur strokes you put down. Taper and curve of each hair is also worth considering. This dog has short and smooth fur, so I make sure that the strokes are uniform and that the fur in each section follows the same direction. Instead, if I had the hair strokes pointing in lots of different directions, the fur would look rough or wiry. Suggesting texture is something I work on throughout the layering process, which is why I'll pay attention to the direction of the strokes that I lay down from the beginning, as this will help contribute to the feeling of the fur in the end result, but the distinct individual hairs are something that I only add in my final layers. I use liquid solvents to blend out between every few layers to begin with, and this creates more smooth and even coverage over the paper, and it also merges the separate pencil layers together. There are lots of different liquid solvents you can use, but I use the Zest-It pencil blend, which I've made a video on, so I'll leave that in the description box down below and in the cards in the top right as always. Using liquid solvents also helps to soften any sharp detail that I put in too early. When rendering fur, I start off considering the rough and general form, so the large overall shapes and any tufts of fur or blocks of shadow or highlight. And as I layer, I get more specific with the details, and the details towards the end I don't blend out and make sure to keep crisp and defined. This is when using a fixative can really help, which is something that I did on this piece. I used the brush and pencil touch-up texture, which is a liquid with fine particles suspended in it that dries to a matte, textured and transparent finish. I can paint this onto my work using a brush, so I only have to apply it to areas that need it. The touch-up texture isolates the layers below from any new ones that I apply later on, and the particles add a bit of tooth, allowing the pencils to easily grab onto the paper to create bright and crisp details. This medium is also ideal for when you've burnished the paper surface smooth by adding lots and lots of layers or applying firm pressure so that it can no longer accept more pigment. I've also found that using some sort of fixative or sealant helps to bring out the colour of the piece and make the black areas appear darker and richer. And of course, sealing the dark pigment onto the paper means that the artwork is a little safer to handle, so I can be a little less wary of potential smudging. And the finishing touches are to add in the whiskers and also the individual strands and tufts that stand out around the silhouette of the animal. And that's all I have to say for today. As always, check out the description box for more information and goodies, and if you have any questions, be sure to ask them down below in the comment section. That's where I'll respond the fastest, and perhaps your question can help another viewer out too. So here's the final product. It took about 10 hours to complete this A5 commission, and I'm really happy with the outcome, and I'm glad to say that the client is too. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, be sure to leave it a like and share it with your arty friends if you think that they might find it helpful too. Don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to keep up to date with my future arty videos. Thank you very much for watching, hope you have a lovely week, and I'll see you in the next video.